Good morning, everybody. Again, welcome to Art 195, 3D modeling for animation. Yeah, I noticed I was muted. You should be able to hear me now. Can everybody hear me okay now? Yes, okay, good. So today I'm going to give you a tour of LightWave. And best I can, some of you may choose to switch to Blender later. And if you do, try to point out some of the differences. So LightWave and the similarities. LightWave really is 3 different applications that you would be using. Since this is a modeling program, we spend most of our time in Modeler. So you can see down in my dock down here, since I use a Mac, that we have Modeler. This is where you build your models. You also have Layout, which is where you add lighting, where you place cameras, and you either animate or you, in our case, with the 3D class, 3D modeling class, you create a rendering of a still image. Okay. Now, the 4th application that really should be working well in the background is over here, and it's called the hub. And what that does is it links the modeler to Layout. And when it's working properly, in Layout, when you make changes to a model, it will automatically update it in Modeler. And likewise, when you make changes in Modeler, it will automatically update the model that's been placed in Layout. Okay. The way I learned to use and to create in 3D modeling was I like the 4-up, which is what you see here, the quad view. It's important to understand if you've used computer graphics programs before, like Illustrator and Photoshop, that they are 2D. And if you're familiar with algebra, you use an X and a Y axis. So the vertical would be your Y axis and the horizontal would be your X axis. Well, in 3D modeling and animation, we've now added the 3rd axis, the Z axis. And LightWave, that is the axis that is perpendicular to the screen. Okay, if you're on Blender, it's not. It is, they use the mathematical interpretation. So it's a Z up. And then you would have your X and your Y on the horizontal flat plane. And LightWave, it's a little bit different. We have the Y up. So it's Y and then X horizontal, and then Z is perpendicular to the screen. I like having the quad view because it's important that you see at least 3 different views to accurately size and place objects in your environment. So the default settings for this are in the upper left-hand corner, we have the top view. In the bottom left-hand corner, we have the back or the front view. And then in the bottom right view, we have the right view. And then in the upper right-hand corner, we have the perspective view. Okay. So I don't know how well you can see my screen. Let me see if I can turn up. Yeah, I've got brightness turned up all the way. So hopefully you can see this well. So let's, those are the views. By default, you're working most of the time in wireframe. However, in perspective view, we will view it in texture view, and I'll show you what they look like in just a minute. And if you want to see a single view and hide the other views, you can always do that at any time. But let's go over the workspace itself so you can see what's going on. Along the top, we have a series of tabs. The first one is the Create tab. So these are the tools that you typically use to create the objects that you want to make. And you'll see all of those tools over to the left. Okay, they're below the editors. So what we have here under File and Editors, these are with, it doesn't matter what tab you have up, you will see these. But then down here under primitives or your basic tools that you use, then you have text tools. And if you want to add points, you can do that, or polygons, or you want to create curves, you can do that. So these are your basic modeling tools here. Then if you want to edit any of those objects that you've created, then you would use the tools available under the Modify tab. So if I want to move an object, if I want to rotate an object, if I want to scale an object, those are three common things that you do. They would be found under the Modify tab. The Multiply tab enables you to add geometry to an object that you've already created typically. The Detail tab is another way of, again, straightening, making some specific adjustments to some of the models that you've created that you won't probably use as much as the Create and Modify and Multiply tabs. There's also the Construct tab. Depending on how you build your model, you can use this frequently. This is where you will find the Boolean settings. We will get into that later this semester about how to, Boolean functions are a way of combining geometry, subtracting geometry, or creating the difference between geometry between two objects. There's also the Map tab, which is used for color maps and that sort of thing. In this class, we don't use it that much. The same with the UV tab. UV maps we cover at the very end of the semester. We have the setup. This would be for fiber effects and stuff. Again, that's covered at the very end. So most of these at the very end here, these tabs under selection and that sort of thing, we don't use that much. I mean, we have layer tabs, we have view tabs. We will use some of these in utilities, but the principal tabs that you'll be using are Create, Modify, Multiply, sometimes Detail, and Construct. So these are the principal tools that we'll be working with here. So those are found at the top. At the bottom, it's important to note the grid size. Right now, it tells us that each of these units in this grid are 500 millimeters. Typically, you can change the grid size and make it 1 meter. You can work in, by default, in metrics or any other units if you wish. It's important to note that when you create an object, you want to affect the points, the edges, or the polygons. All of the objects that you create are generally constructed of points and polygons. And you can also affect the entire volume if you wish. Now, right now, you can also choose Action Center. By default, it's set to mouse. If I want, I can select this to the selection or the pivot point. I can do a variety of different things to change this. We can change its origin. By default, it's set to the center of the object. We can affect the symmetry of it down here. So these are all tools that we will be using frequently to determine what part of an object that we want to affect. Then we have a series of tabs over to the right, which stand for weight, texture, morph maps, color maps, selection, what are they called? Selection sets, that sort of thing. We will use some of these a little bit later as well. But right now, let's go ahead and let me show you how some of this works. So by default, I like, when I start building objects, I like working with I'm imagining that if I were to build an object, that I kind of lay the work out on the floor first and then build it upwards. That's typically how I like to work. The other thing that I like doing too is that you can either build your objects relative to one another, or you can build them to specific sizes that you specify. So if specific units are important, then I like having what's called a numeric requester available. So that's found down here. You can also hit N on your keyboard. Come on. And that brings it back up. Now, I don't have a tool selected, so nothing is visible in that panel. But if I select, for example, just to simply, I want to make a box, I can either do that with my mouse, and I can click and drag from the top view. And you can see in the perspective view that I've created from the top plane a flat plane that automatically resides on the 0, 0 axis of the Y plane. So now if I want to give it dimension, I see these little orange widgets here that are at the corners and the center of each of these from the back view. If I want, or the right view, if I want to now give it height, I can click and I can drag and bring it up like so. Now, as I'm doing that, when I look at the numeric requester, I can see the width, the height, and the depth, and the center of my object. So I can change all of those features from here, or I can continue to use my mouse and click and drag and resize everything here. All right. So that gives us, by default, just a simple box or cube. Now, if I want to reset this, I can go back and I can reset. And what that does, the default settings are a nice way to get started, because the default width, height, and depth of an object is 1 meter for cubes, and generally for spheres and cones and stuff, which are part of all of these primitives. And you'll find that even with very elaborate organic modeling, if you wanted to create a character or a face or something like that, you're going to start with a basic cube. So anyway, this is where we would start here. Now, when you're done with this and you say, you know what, I'm happy with my cube. I'm ready to move on and create another object. Or I want, later on, if I want to modify the object, I can. But when you're done creating it, it's important to understand in LightWave that when you're done, you need to turn the tool off. So I'm going to go back over here under box and click and notice that it is now fixed. So now if I want to move it, or if I want to resize it, or if I want to do anything to this, I have to switch and I have to use the modify tools. Okay, so let's go ahead and with modify, the default, some of these keystrokes are something that you should memorize, and one would be T for move. So if I hit T, you'll notice that the numeric requester changes and we have the numeric move tool. Now, again, you can use if I want to offset it exactly 1 meter to the X, using the X-axis, the Y, or the Z, I can. Or I can simply take my mouse and I can move it around. So now I'm clicking and dragging, but notice that as my mouse moves on the top view, it's like taking a chair and sliding it around the floor. Okay. I can always use Command or Control Z to undo. If I want to move the box up or down, then I would have to do that from either the back, front, or the side view. So now when I click and I drag, notice that it is moving up and down and left and right. Okay, so depending on the view that you're using will determine how these things move. Now, you can move these from perspective view, but I don't recommend it. I recommend only using perspective view to view the final outcome and make very particular final changes. So again, if I come back to actions and I reset, I can go back here and then I can undo. And it takes me back to where it was in the very center. Okay, let me undo again. Let's make sure that I'm in the center of this. So if you want, now this is really very tiny, but if I want all of this to fit to the screen, so probably all of you can barely see what I'm doing, if you hit the A key on your keyboard, that fits to all. Now I can come back over here in my perspective view and I can see that pretty clearly. There's also these little buttons or widgets in the upper right-hand corner of each quadrant. This allows me not to move the object, but to move my view in relationship to the object here. Notice that they all move around. Okay. The next one over here is the a zoom tool. It allows me to zoom in or zoom out. The tool after that, for example, if I only wanted to see the perspective view and nothing else, I would click on this one in the upper right-hand corner and it hides the other views. And then when I click on it again, it brings them all back. So sometimes, I don't know how many of you have ever drawn or painted, but you'll look at things and you'll be very close up and get a detailed view, and then you want to zoom out and get an overall view. Well, you can do that by, your overall view is here, and your very tight close-up view would be by clicking on this button. Now, the only one that's activated to be able to spin this around, because these are orthographic views, is the perspective view. So now in the perspective view, I can move my mouse to the left or to the right, and it spins it around, and I can move my mouse forwards or backwards, and I can see the bottom or the top, like so. And again, if I want to zoom out a little bit, I can do that, and I can move that up or down so I can get a better view of what my box looks like in its finished form. In the meantime, as I said, the other views are in wireframe. And you'll notice that we have other little tools in the upper left-hand corner. Now, if I want, I can have two perspective views, if that helps me, or two top views. I can click right here and I can hold this one down and I can say, I want this to be perspective view. And notice that it's a wireframe, but it's in perspective now. Okay. So now I have two perspective views. If I want to bring this back to the top view, then I do that. So you have all of these options. Later on, we will get to layered view, UV, texture, and so on. But I'm going to put this back to the top view. Now, we have that for each of these quadrants. And then after that, you can see by default that the top, the back or front, and the right or left views are by default in wireframe. If I want to see the top view in textured view or in sketch view or any number of these flat shaded, I'm going to use texture. You can see that, but then you can't see, the points, you can't see the polygons. So I like, more often than not, I like leaving these views in wireframe and just using the perspective view for the textured view, or in some cases, I will use textured wired so that I can actually see the wireframe that constructs this. Now, if I wanted to edit this further, if I wanted to manipulate individual points, or if I wanted to rotate this or do whatever, I could do that. Now, right now, I have that if I want to move this, it's by selection as opposed to the mouse. So I'm going to show you, if I want to rotate this, let's go ahead and let's use the mouse. Action center is the mouse. And because another thing, let me point out that's important with LightWave is that if nothing is selected, then everything is selected. So if I want to move this, notice that move is still selected. If I click and I drag, everything is moved because nothing is selected. But if I only select one thing, and now that we're selected to point view, I'll turn off move and I'll select just this point here. So I'll select it. There you go. It's very hard to see, but it's a little orange dot. You can see it here. So the point is selected. So now if I select move, and let's say from perspective view, I click and I move that, notice that I can deform my cube and I can move just that point. So if I have nothing selected, everything moves. If I have a single point or multiple points selected, then I can do that. Now, if I want to select additional points, I hold down the shift key and I can turn off, I have to turn off move first. I select another point and now I can go ahead and I can hit T for move again. And I can, again, move, let's zoom out a little bit. And I can move each of these. And now you'll notice at both of those points, but everything that's connected to them moves as well. Okay, so I'm going to turn off move and I can go back several steps. I'm going to undo, take that back. And then when I'm ready to deselect the point, if it's still selected, I make sure that I turn off move or whatever tool I'm using, and I can move in the lower left-hand corner and click, and that deselects that point. So that's important too. Now that's if I have point view selected. If I have polygon view or polygon or edge selected, I'll use polygon first. Notice that the cube is constructed of points and polygons. There are a total of 8 points that make up this, this cube. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 back here that's hidden. And we have a total of 6 polygons or planes that make up this cube. So if I want to select a polygon now, make sure that no tool is selected and I can click. And notice that I just have the top view selected now, that top polygon. So now what if I want to move that, I can go ahead and I can hit T for move. And when I move this, again, notice that it's taking all the other, and it's dragging all the units with it, but I'm only moving that top polygon. And that's it. And again, I can move it up or down or whatever I want. And I can rotate it. So what I want to show you now is what happens when you have mouse center versus selection, mouse action center versus the selection centered. So I'm going to start with mouse and show you what happens. And I'm going to deselect the polygon. So let's turn off move, deselect. And now what I want to do is I want to select rotate. So I can either use the rotate tool over here under the modify tab. Okay. And I can hit Y for rotate, or I can hit Y for rotate. Now, with the mouse being the action center, I'm going to go ahead and move my mouse over this point right here. And now I'll click and I'll drag, and notice that it's spinning about the Y axis where my mouse was as I move my mouse left to right. So if you want to move or you want to rotate based on the action center of the mouse, that's what you would do. If we use the action center, the center of our selection, now our selection, remember, if nothing is selected, then everything is selected. So now what I can do is that it doesn't matter where I put my mouse. When I click and I drag, notice it's spinning again about the Y axis, but the whole object spins, and it doesn't matter where my mouse is because it's using the selection that's this time. So again, if I were to go ahead and I turn off rotate and I select the top polygon, again, I have polygon mode selected down here. And I'm going to go ahead and select rotate and make sure that the selection center is the center of, it is is the center of the selection. Well, I only have this polygon selected. So now if I click and I drag, notice that it doesn't matter where my mouse is, but it's rotating just that polygon. And that's it, and everything else that's connected to it. Okay. So some important things to remember, that when you want to use a tool, you select it. When you're done using the tool, you turn it off. And then you'll notice that I don't want to affect this polygon anymore. So I move in the lower left-hand corner and I click to make sure that it's deselected now. So let's go ahead and we can add another object to this. And this is kind of getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but I'll show you some of the things that maybe you would want to do. I was mentioning Boolean functions, but what we can do is we can, if we want, we can use layers or not. It depends. I like using layers and then combining things later on into a single layer, if that works for me. But I'll show you what happens. I'm going to go ahead now and I'm going to add another object. So I'm going to go to create. And I'm going to go to, let's go ahead and use the ball here. And I'm going to go ahead and go to actions. And I'm going to go to reset so that it's 1 meter. And I'm going to go ahead and activate. Here's my ball. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and from the center, I will click and I'll move it over. Okay. And I'm done with it and I'm happy and everything is good. Now, another thing that you'll notice too, there's so many variables, and I'm probably going to overwhelm you with some of these, is that right now the axis is oriented by default along the Y, but in the numeric requester, I can change it to the X or the Z. And we can rotate it later, but sometimes it's better if you know in advance and make your choices there. So I'm done making my shape. And now what I want to do is I want to fix it. So I'll turn the tool off. And now let's say I decide, I want to move the ball. I want to put it on top of the cube. So I'm going to use the move tool. So I'm going to go ahead and go to modify, or I just hit T for move. And I'm going to proceed to move. But when I do that, notice that they both move. That's because if nothing is selected, then everything is selected. And they're also both on the same layer. So I have a choice. If I want to move the sphere and I'm in polygon mode, what I can do is I can select the entire polygon. Now there's a variety of ways of selecting it. I can click and drag to highlight a couple of polygons. And then what I can do is I can go to select and I can say select connected and make sure that the entire group of polygons that make up this sphere are selected. Now, when I hit T for move, it only moves that one object. And again, it's important to look at all three views, or actually all four views, just to make sure that if I want this centered on top, I can do that. Okay. So there we have that. Now, if you want to keep these on separate layers and work on parts of your object and then assemble them later, we can do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this object. I'm going to go ahead and hit Command X to cut it. And then at the top right, we see these little squares here. And these are layers. So now what I can do is I can select a new layer, and to see where my active layer was, I can click the bottom half of that there. So you can see that it's in black wireframe. So that indicates that it's now in the background. So what makes this 3D modeling program different than 2D models, 2D programs like Illustrator and Photoshop, is that in LightWave, either your object is in the foreground or it's in the background. And they can all be separate from one another, and you can have several objects in the foreground or several objects in the background, but that's it. So now I have a new foreground one selected, But if I click the bottom half here, then it puts that cube in the background. Now I can go ahead and I can paste it. The ball that I copied, Command V or Control V. Notice that it remembered its size and its position in our universe to place the object. So now if I want both of them in the foreground, I hold down the Shift key and I click the first layer so that they're both in the foreground. If I only want, for example, the cube to be in the foreground, I can do that and I can hide the other layers if that helps me, or I can click in the bottom half and put the sphere in the background. So I can see them both, but the only one that's active is the one that's in the foreground. Okay. So that's some of the things that we can do here. So I'm going to go ahead and when I'm done building a model, what I like to do is to put them all on the same layer so that when I send it over to layout, I've got everything intact. So I'm not working with multiple layers. What I want to do now, which is fairly common, is that you can see that there is just a gray kind of white generic skin that's on our surface. Well, if I want to create a new surface, I think it's a good idea to put in a placeholder for each of these. So what I'm going to do now is with the sphere, the only one in the foreground, I'm going to hit Q. And what I do now is I'm going to name this, and I don't want this to be the default, but I'm going to name this sphere. Okay, and I'm going to assign a color to it. And this will only be a placeholder, but I'll go ahead and I'll make it this blue. Okay. And as soon as I'm done, it turns blue. Now let's go back to the cube. And I'm going to assign a placeholder surface for it. So again, with it's the only one in active and in the foreground. Now, if they were both active and they were both in the foreground, they would have both changed. Okay, so now I hit Q again, and I'm going to name this one cube. And it has blue as the last one that I used, and this one I'll make red. Okay, and I click OK, and it's red. Now, if I want to see the surfaces that I have created, then what we would do over here is we would look at the surface editor, and you can see that we have our default, and we have cube, and we have sphere. Now, if I want to change those colors, once I've assigned them, I have to do that from my surface editor. You can't hit Q anymore and do that. You do that from here. So this surface editor is what controls all of our surfaces. And as you can see from all of the options here, and if we go into edit, graph mode, or node editor, they can get really, really complicated, Okay, but I'm just working with basic ones for today. Okie doke. So now when I'm done with this, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to decide for myself, you know what, I want to take and put both of these together. So I'll cut this one, Command X, Control X, Command V, so they're both on the same layer, and I'm happy with my model. I'm all done. So now what I need to do is, if we can see right here, you can have multiple objects open at the same time. This one has a little asterisk next to it because it's unnamed and it's not been saved. So anytime you have an object that, even if you have saved it, if you've made changes to it, you will see a little asterisk, and it will indicate that changes have been made and they need to be saved. So I'm going to go now and I'm going to go to File. And before I save it, I'm going to do a Save As. But before I do that, I'm going to create a new folder on my, my desktop. You can put yours wherever you want. But I'm going to put here, I'm going to put right click in the upper right hand corner to create a new folder. And I'm going to name it Content. This is unique to LightWave 2. I'm going to name it Content fall 2021, okay? And then inside that folder in LightWave, we need 3 folders. So I'm going to put right click to create 3 brand new folders. So the first folder I'm going to name images. So if there are any images that I use for backgrounds or any images that I use for surfaces, like on my gallery, the floor was a wood surface, things like that, I would want them there, or any final renderings. The next one is going to be, whoops, I didn't want to do that. I don't want to go inside the folder. I just want to rename it. This one is going to be named objects. And the last one is going to be named scenes. Okay, so now I've created something. I've assigned some basic surfaces to it, and I need to save it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to Modeler, and I'm going to save it. I'm going to go to Save As, Save Object As. And I'm going to go to my desktop. My desktop is usually pretty cluttered. Okay, here's content, fall 2021. And I'm going to save it in my objects folder. And I'll call it first demo. Okay, so that's the name of that object, first demo. Now what I can do is I can close everything up and I can say I'm done for the day, or I can decide, you know what, I want to finalize this and put it inside layout, and I want to create a rendering of it to see what it looks like. So now what I can do is I can take, and you can see the little tab in the upper right-hand corner, and I can start by saying synchronize with layout, so that wherever I change in layout or modeler, they are synchronized with one another and will update. So now what I can do is I can send object over to, says send object over to layout. And you can see that it switches and it sends it over to layout. Now, by default, when we're in layout, and this is the only place that you can have lights, the only place you can have cameras, by default, there is an environment light. And by default, there is a single camera, and it shows it from camera view. Now, if I switch, I can go from camera view to perspective view, and that's not the same as, okay, as the camera view. Think of perspective view as if you're a director of a movie or a particular setup, then you would be in the director's chair. And that's not the same thing that the cinematographer is seeing through the camera. So I can match these, which we can get to later. You can see that there's a default light up here. Here's the default environment light. And you can see here's a representation of the camera. Well, now what I can do is I can switch back to camera view. And what I want to do at the bottom here, so now that we're in layout, we're no longer in modeler, we can either select objects, we can select bones if we were going to animate a character. I can create or select just lights. I can select the camera. And that's really what I want to do. I'm going to leave the default lighting, but I'm going to move my camera right now. I don't want to move my objects. I just want to move the camera. So if I wanted to create an animation, my timeline is up here. By default, auto keyframes are set. Over here, similar to what we had in Modeler, we have various tabs for tools. Again, we have items, we have modify, setup. Most of these effects tools and things like that, we will not be using. We'll be using items and modify most of the time. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to move. So let's go to modify. I want to move, but you have to make sure that the camera is selected. So now what if I do, if I click and I move my mouse to the left, it moves the camera to the left. Okay. Now, if I want to move the camera up or down, you right mouse and click. So let's say I want to move the camera up. So I'm right clicking and I'm moving the mouse forward. Now, if I want to get my object centered again, I need to rotate the camera. So I'm going to go ahead and left click now after I hit Y. And here is my object. Now, I don't have anything in the background. What I can do though right now is that I'm looking at this at textured shaded solid view. If I want to see what this looks like in the final rendering, I switch up here to VPR mode. And this is what it's going to look like when it's rendered. This is what the environment light, the effect that it has on these surfaces. Now, I have not done anything to them but assign a default color. Okay, they add some reflectivity by default, and there is a gradient background and stuff. And if that's what you want, that's fine. But now what I do before I finish up today is I'm going to go ahead and I can render this. So I can first save my layout with the light settings, the camera settings, and everything here. So that's probably what I should do. I'm going to go ahead and go to save, and I'm going to do save scene as. Okay, it's going to take a second here because this it's taking a lot of, yeah. So I want to go in here. I'm going to go back to desktop. There we go. Let's go into the content, fall 2021. And now I'm going to go into the scene folder and save that there. And I'll call it first demo. So the scene will be named first demo. Now I can go ahead and I can render this. So when you are sending me your final files, they're going to be final 2D files or renderings of this. And so now what I would want to do to get my final rendering is I want to go to the render tab, and I'm just going to leave the default settings, and that's it. But we will get to that later, but I can go to camera properties and I can change the render size of what I'm doing, and I can change the number of samples, and I can add motion blurs if I'm animating it, and all sorts of things. So I'm leaving it just, you know, the default size that I have here is 1280 by 720. Okay. And now what I want to do is under the render tab, what I want to do is I want to come over here and I want to render frame. Notice that when in our class, not the animation class, but we don't need any multiple frames at the moment. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave the frame at 0. And what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to render frame. And when I do that, because I don't have much going on here, it's going to render fairly quickly. And you can see it going through its motions. The rendering is complete. I can go ahead and abort this now, and I can take this one. This fortunately only took a little over 10 seconds. And this is the finished size of this, so not a big deal. If you want to see this a little bit larger, I can go to 200%. And now what we can do when you're ready to send this to me is that you need to save this. So we're going to go ahead to File. We're going to save up here, Save RGBA. So now you can see that these are all the different file formats they can be saved as. My recommendation is just to save it as a JPEG, right down here, a LightWave JPEG or a LightWave Photoshop file, or maybe even both. So I'm going to save it as a JPEG for right now, because that's what you're going to send to me. Right. There we go. So now we're going to call it first demo rendering. And again, I want to go to my desktop I want to go to the content for this class, and I want to save this one in the image folder. And I click save. Now I can open this up later on, or I can send it to someone or keep it. Now for the gallery that I create, I have hundreds of renderings that I've done. For every little thing that I changed, and near the end of the completion of the model, I was tweaking very subtle things, and you couldn't see the changes in VPR mode. Now, some of the other things that we can do is I can go back to Modeler here, and we can make changes to it here. Remember, I said I can come back to any one of these and I can update them. And when I do, if I bring up the surface editor, for example, and let's take the sphere. I'm going to change the color of it. Okay, and let's make it this orange. So that's changed. And now if I go back and I switch back to switch to layout. Okay, and I move this, see how it's been updated. That's when you want the hub to be working for you. So you can go back and forth from modeler to layout, and from layout back to modeler. Okay, I'm going to go back to modeler again. Come on. There we go. And now what I want to do is show you a couple of other features. I'm going to close the surface editor. But if there are certain ways that you want to customize this, one of the things that you can do is hit D on your screen. Whoops, let me make sure that move is turned off. D. Here we go for your display options. And you can see a whole bunch of options for yourself. Later on, when we're doing the, after we've done the table and lamp, if you want to see an image and use that as a template, which we do for the reboot mic character, we can bring an image into the background here. Now that does not render and layout, but it gives us the size and proportions and that sort of thing. Under layout itself, you can see that for selection points, I just leave all the default colors. Okay, if you want to show guides, you can. I have show normals selected. We'll talk about surface normals later. I like showing the grid. If you turn off the grid, it goes away. I like seeing the grid. It gives me reference sizes and points. Under GL, we have some other options that are available to us. Under units, you can see by default, we have metric. But if you want to switch to English units, you can do that. I just use standard units here. But this is where you can change any number of things here. Okay, and customize it. Under view, let's see. I like having for the my perspective view. If I look at the top right, you can see that I have independent zoom selected. I like doing that, and independent rotation. That's an important thing so that it doesn't affect the others, but I'm just getting a nice overview of it so that when I zoom in or zoom out or I rotate it, it doesn't affect any of the other views. And again, I can come back here and I can switch to texture view. If I want to see it from, front or back view, I can look at it from flat shaded, and you can see that you'll see subtle difference, but by default, I usually use wireframe. Okay. So I've covered quite a bit today and given you kind of a basic tour of how LightWave works. I've used it for a long time. And as I mentioned, if you're interested in seeing what I do, the most recent thing that I've done is that virtual gallery. So that's an example of the kind of work that I do. And all of the objects in that gallery were created with LightWave and either printed 2D or with our 3D printers. So that's what, floats my boat, what interests me. And as I said, if those of you who decide to use Blender, that's fine. But the Blender videos that I have available are not done by me. They're available online. And I encourage you to watch those. They're very professional, they're very polished, and very thorough to give you an idea of how Blender works. It's kind of an up and coming, well, it's been around a long time. It is free. It doesn't cost you anything, and it works really, really well. It's different. What can I say? It's they're both high-end programs. One is like driving a Porsche, and the other one's like driving a Lamborghini or something. They're both very expensive cars. Just they function a little bit differently, but they will get, they do the same thing fundamentally. So before we end today, do you guys have any questions for me? I can pause the recording of this, and I will post this online within an hour or so. And let's see, I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording. Okay, so if that's it today, let's go ahead and call it a day. I will post this on my YouTube channel within about an hour or so. And I hope to see all of you again on Monday. And on Monday, I'm going to start building the table and lamp. If no one shows up, I repeat, then I won't record anything, and I will assume that you are referring to the videos that I recorded last year, which are the basic, fundamentally the same as what I'm doing right now. A little bit different. I mean, I follow a very loose outline, but everything will be pretty much the same. It's covered. Okay. And again, you can either find those videos in modules in Canvas, or you can also find them or a couple of different ways in on my YouTube channel. So if that's it, I'm going to say goodbye. You guys are free to leave, and I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.